basic data analysis process that I used to follow when I was analysing airports is to break down the objective, the information you want to see, to discover your current measurements and can anything be improved with those measurements, to summarise what these measurements mean using an average, a mean, median or mode, or to compare two measurements together, two metrics together. And then interpret these results. What do they tell you? And based on what they tell you, might have to go back and look at the analysis again. So I'm going to run through that as a visual example. So as you can see, the first step is to take your objective, which we have here, to discover what metrics or measurements can be used, to summarize these with a mean, median, mode, and to maybe even compare them. And then what do the results tell you? And then to repeat this based on whether or not there's any, based on what the results tell you, to repeat it. So how to fit more planes on a runway, that's the metric that we're going to figure out today. So I'll show you the problem. Let's say you've got a runway here, with nice down the side, some taxiways in and out. So when planes land on a runway, you can only have one plane using the runway at a time. So if there's a plane coming in to land, that plane should, I've forgotten how to draw an aeroplane. That plane should land first, then exit the runway. And once that plane's exited the runway, another plane waiting to get onto the runway can then proceed and take off. So that's the problem we're trying to figure out, how to minimize this time that planes spend here, minimize this time that planes spend here, and allow the next plane to land. What timing should the next plane land in? So this is the objective, how to fit more planes onto a runway. Now, why we want to do that? So doing our why, how, what analysis. So why we want to fit more planes on this runway is that airlines pay a fee to the airport for landing. They pay air traffic control fees, or they pay air traffic control fees, or they pay landing fees, parking fees, airport fees, all sorts of fees are paid. And those are part of, they bring those fees in from passengers. So having more passengers through the airport means more revenue for the airport, more revenue for the airline, and more people traveling. So more people should be happy. So more planes on the runway allows airports to be better utilized without having to build more airports or more runways. So I think London Gatwick is one of the busiest airports I've come across. I think Mumbai is the other one that only has one runway. So when you're landing at Gatwick, there's only one runway that planes have to both use to arrive and take off. So it can be a bit of a challenge fitting those planes into Gatwick. So that's where this sort of analysis is important. So what are the measurements involved in allowing more planes onto the runway? So let's take a look at our diagram here. We have the time between aircraft. So that's one metric that we can look at. So this is our how are we going to measure it? So why is we want more planes on the runway? Why is we want more revenue? More planes means more revenue. How we're going to measure it is we're going to look at the different metrics involved. I should say that's more of a what. How we measure these is with radar positions. So there's a radar that measures all the arriving aircraft. There are also different timing points that you can use, such as some airports measure the time at which aircraft cross the runway. Radar can measure position over time. So we know, how we do this analysis, how we meet this objective, is to look at where these planes are at certain times. We can use that to say the what of what we're going to measure. So the what here is the time between aircraft. There are also other things we can measure, such as once the aircraft, I'm going to use a different color, so that once the aircraft touches or crosses this threshold, we can measure how long it takes to come off. So again, using this radar, we can measure the distance between two planes. We can measure the time it takes for the pilot to move from this stationary position in Q onto the runway, because that's when he's occupying the runway. And then the pilot can taxi and take off. And we can measure that from the time at which he crosses the threshold here. So how we're measuring these, so why we're measuring these things is to get more revenue for the airport, get more planes and passengers through. How we're measuring these things is with radar data. Radar data gives us a position and a time. And what we're going to measure is the what of this is our pilot lineup time, our time between planes, and our actually time between planes doesn't really help. So what we're going to measure is our pilot lineup time, so the time it takes the pilot to get here, and the time the planes spend on the runway. There are other measurements we can do, like this time between planes, but for simplicity, keep it there. Okay, so moving on, discover our current measurements. Can anything be improved? So there are our current measurements. They've come out of the first analysis on what we're measuring. And we've discussed that this is, so when looking at your current measurements, it's important to consider the quality of the source information. This is this garbage in, garbage out principle. So where is the data coming from? What is the source? So I've talked about using radar data at the moment. However, not all airports record all radar at the same resolution. For example, the radar might only capture the plane within a 10-meter space. So we don't know exactly where that is. And when a plane's traveling so fast, it can be hard to tell garbage in, garbage out. So we've talked about using the radar as how we're going to measure this data, but not every airport uses radar in the same way. For example, they might have it might be a simple timer at the air traffic control tower, and the using radar to measure the position and time of our aircraft. However, not every airport uses radar. And certainly I've heard stories of, I've never had to do it myself, I've heard stories of people standing there in air traffic control towers timing how long it takes the plane to exit the runway. So we're very fortunate to have radar, but when conducting your own data analysis, it's important to consider any problems that might arise with the source. How accurate is the source information? And that can lead to, if you're performing analysis on inaccurate source information, you're going to get inaccurate analysis. That's the garbage in, garbage out principle. So the radar data in this case, when I worked with airports, the radar data was usually sufficient. However, sometimes they did have manual timing information for some of the metrics, and sometimes the radar didn't work. It's not safety critical, don't worry. So when we set up our analysis to measure based on this position and time from the radar, we're setting up two metrics in this case. The time the pilot takes to line up his plane onto the runway, and the time a plane, whether landing or arriving, spends on the runway. So the next part of, so identifying if anything can be improved, our radar in this case is fine, so nothing can be improved. Garbage in, garbage out, spoke about that. What is measured will improve. So defining whatever metrics we define, they're going to be the ones that people will focus on improving in the future. So do our metrics reflect our objective? And how do our metrics reflect our objective? So our objective is to get more planes onto the runway. So how come I'm talking about runway occupancy time, or how come I'm talking about pilot lineup time? What do those have to do with how to fit more planes on a runway? So simply, the less time planes spend on a runway, or the less time planes spend occupying a runway, the more planes that can be fit on it. Makes sense, right? So the time the pilot spends lining up is time that he's occupying on the runway. And of course, the time that a plane actually spends on the runway is time occupying the runway. There are a few more metrics you can do, and you can take this a bit further by looking at by counting the number of planes that use the runway and by analyzing the distance between planes. But we're going to keep it simple here and talk about just these two metrics. So whatever you measure will improve. So if you start timing pilots on how long they're spending lining their planes up on the runway, pilots will spend less time lining their planes up on the runway. Most of that's good, but there are some considerations that not all data analysis is the same. So for your project, you just bear in mind that whatever you measure, whatever metrics you put in place, they're the ones that are going to improve over time, whether that's increase or decrease. So the next step is to take these measurements and find some way of summarizing them to compare them. So there's no point so we've got, in our analysis, from the radar, what the radar will tell us is we have plane A spent 30 seconds on the runway, plane B spent 35 seconds on the runway after the pilot spent 10 seconds lining up, plane C spent 37 seconds after the pilot spent 5 seconds lining up. So we get samples like this. Plane A was an arrival in this case. So we get some samples like this from the radar data, and now we want to turn that into, we want to summarize all these measurements. Now the simplest way I found to summarize measurements like this is to use an average. So we've got our runway occupancy time, and we've got our pilot lineup time. So there are a few different types of average that can be applied. We can use taken back to high school, the mean, median, or mode. Now, this is also an important consideration to come back to your source when deciding how to summarize. For example, sometimes the radar will mistrack which plane is which, and you might get let's say plane Z spent 900 seconds on the runway. And this isn't the radar miscalculating, this is the assignment of the plane's identification in the radar. So some of the raw data might not be very representative of the actual behavior of our objective, because we're talking about squeezing more planes into the runway. We don't need to worry about the one or two outliers that where planes spend a long time or maybe there was a go around. So it's important to consider back to our objective and back to our measurement as you go through each step, to consider back up the chain about what we did previously. It will save you having to go around in the future. So for example, for this plane, we can either filter it out of the data set before we take our average or our summary, or we can use in our summary, in the way we do our summary, we can account for these outliers. So for example, if we did median, the median, regardless of the plane, doesn't change. It's the middle one here. Whereas if we did our average, our mean, then it would if it included this 900, it would be very high. And our mode, they're all about the same. So mode is irrelevant. They're not all the same in this case for this metric. So mode isn't really relevant. So pilot lineup time is also the same. We do our mean would be somewhere between them. Our mode would be there. Our median would be as these two, and our mode would be whatever else. So in this case, I would probably select mean to summarize the pilot lineup time because of the small sample size. But from experience, I usually select median to talk about the runway occupancy time. I find that some of these extraneous ones can sneak through even if you filter your data set beforehand. So this is a good way to summarize. This is just the basic process for data analysis. A more complicated process would involve filtering this table before any summary is done. And you can use that based on your input, based on your knowledge, and to try to remove some of the garbage if your input is giving you garbage. So Then once we understand this, we can, moving on to step 4, what do the results tell you? So our results tell us that planes spend about 34 seconds on the runway, and it takes pilots about 7.5 seconds to line up. So one of the questions going forward from here is, can these things change? What makes these numbers change? And for example, we can look at type of aircraft. Do these numbers change by the type of aircraft? Do these numbers change by the time of day? Do these numbers change by the... actually, they're the most common ones I can think of. So the two most common ones I can think of for these metrics is to see whether our measurements change by the type of aircraft or change by the time of day. So that's how we can compare the variables by looking... Oh, okay. Oh, once we've come up with some summary function for our metrics, we can look at how to compare these variables. This is where you go back and say, well, what can make these variables change? So yes, we know our average runway occupancy time. We know our average pilot lineup time, but what can make these change? So we go back and say, what about this objective, planes landing on a runway, can lead to these variables changing? And for example, the type of aircraft might lead to a change, and the time of day. Couldn't think of any other information that allows for change like this. So I'd say type of aircraft and time of day. Then, well, for the sake of this simple example, I haven't put these in, but different type of aircraft can lead to different runway occupancy time, different times of day. Maybe I don't know. Part of the analysis is to explore what might make these variables change and to try out based on some of the other information that you've collected. So we're going back again to our source and saying, well, what information have we collected, and how does that, and does any of that information affect is there any relationship between the metrics that we've measured and the other information that we've captured? Okay, obviously there's another summary step in here of using something like time of day, such as capturing this per hour, 1 p.m., 2 p.m., etc. But it depends on what sort of metric you're in. That's a more detailed analysis that I'm not going into in this video. So what do these results tell you? So once you've understood your average, once you've understood your summary, whether it's just the plain summary itself or whether that's including some sort of by type or by time or some other comparison. So what does this tell us? We need something to compare to for what it tells us. So for example, if we had type of airplane available, we can compare and say, oh yes, this category of airplane is taking a long time on the runway. Can that be improved? This type of pilot, the pilots of this type of aircraft are taking a long time to line up. Can that be improved? And we can also compare to other similar systems. So in our case, we're talking about airport runways. So we can compare our results to another airport. So we know I used the example of Gatwick before. We know the pilot lineup time at Heathrow is very quick, is much less than 35 seconds. Well, let's look at what the differences are between Gatwick and Heathrow that allow this to happen. Or let's say that pilots in Mumbai have a lower pilot lineup time. What is it about Mumbai pilots that, are there any lessons there that we can apply? So that's how we use our final step, what do our results tell us, to try to meet our objective. If the results aren't telling us anything that helps with our objective, can we go back and look at the measurements and see is there anything there that we can improve? So it ends up being a bit of a circular process where you define your objective, you define your objective, you look at what you're measuring, you summarize your measurements, you can then, so after summarizing your measurements, you look at the interpret the results. What do they tell you? And then back to your objective. Finally, if your results meet your objective, or if your results tell you something about your objective, whether or not it's doable, how to the extent to which it's doable, whether it's impossible or not, once you've interpreted your results, you get your answer at the end. Your answer comes out of this. But I found it is a cyclical process here about reevaluating your objectives based on your interpretation of results. And that's one of the key differences between, I found it's one of the key differences between data analysis and any other sort of project where you can go back and change your objective based on the results you found. It's not, I found it's in practice, practical data analysis isn't quite the same as a scientific process where you'd have a hypothesis and an objective and you'd prove or disprove your hypothesis. I find an objective to be more flexible because we can, based on our interpretation, we can change our objective. Hopefully that's given you an explanation of data analysis using a practical example of how to land more planes on a runway. If you have any questions or queries, leave a comment down below and I'll try to respond to everyone. I might even make a video if a topic comes up often enough. So hit the subscribe button as well. And if I do make that video, it'll come straight into your feed. So thank you for watching.